You're listening to Beyond Borders, the Immigration Evaluation Podcast, the go-to podcast for mental health professionals who want to be expert immigration evaluators. I'm your host, Dr. Mariella Shibley, and I'm here to help you turn your expertise into impact. Let's get started. I'm really excited to have had the opportunity to interview Cady Voge for the podcast. Cady is a filmmaker and journalist who tells powerful, character-driven stories, often focusing on migration and humanitarian issues. Her new documentary, All We Carry, is her first feature film as director, which follows a young family's journey from Honduras to the U.S. Cady has also directed short films and worked with outlets like NBC, The New Humanitarian, BBC, The Guardian, and Al Jazeera. She spent 5 years living in Colombia, covering everything from Venezuela's economic crisis to the impact of Colombia's peace deal. But migration has been a constant thread in her reporting. She first met the family that's featured in All We Carry while covering the 2018 migrant caravan. And Cady's work has earned recognition from Sundance, Film Independent, and the International Women's Media Foundation. Before filmmaking and journalism, she even ran a peace education nonprofit, traveling around the world. So today we'll be talking about the family in this documentary and their story, what went into making their film, and the powerful moments that didn't make it to the screen. So enjoy. All right. Well, hello, Cady. Thank you so much for joining us. Your film is incredibly moving. It captures not just the trauma of migration, but also the resilience of the human spirit. So I can't wait to dive deeper into the family story and explore what the cameras may not have captured. So to start, can you tell us how you first met the family featured in All We Carry?
Yes, of course. And thank you so much for having me. And thank you for your kind words about the film. Of course, when you spend so much time making something, you just want people to enjoy it and you want it to have an impact. So I first met the family it's pretty much exactly 7 years ago in 2018, the spring of 2018, when I was covering the migrant caravan as a journalist. So at that time, I was living in Latin America. I was living in Bogota, Colombia. I went up to Mexico to cover the caravan because sometimes you have to go to the story. And I was a freelance journalist, and it was about a week into the coverage of that big, huge international story that we were all seeing on the news. And so at that point, there's opportunity to be doing more feature stories, not just, this many people, this distance, not just the breaking news. And so I had pitched to do a mini documentary. So I was doing video journalism. So I got commissioned to do that, and I proposed the idea to follow the story of one family and what it's like to be doing this journey across Mexico. I met up with the caravan in about central Mexico, but you actually see the beginning of their journey in the film without the footage. And that's a unique element of our film that we're really proud of, how intimate our own footage is, but also the adding of the cell phone footage that they filmed throughout their journey and also, later in their story. And so I met up with a caravan in central Mexico, and I was looking for a family who was willing to be documented and accompanied in that way. And I first met Magdiel, the husband in the family. They actually weren't married yet at that time. And I thought he looked quite young. I thought he was maybe even an unaccompanied minor. We just started making conversation by the train. I had been following a different family, but they were a mother and 2 daughters, and all the women and children had just got spots on the bus. And so he was there by the train, and I just started making nervous conversation with him. And then I found out that he did have a family, and that was my assignment, right? Was to follow the family, but they had separated. And he said yes, that I could follow his story. And then just a few minutes later, the train came. So that's the cargo train that, many thousands of people ride on every year. And a few moments later, we got on, and I shot what ends up being the opening shot of the film, which is, just a bunch of kind of snuggled up bodies in these train moving north towards the border.
So it sounds like you definitely wanted to feature a family, and he just happened to sort of cross your path, or was there anything else that drew you to his story or their story in particular out of just so many immigration journeys?
Yes, absolutely. So Like I said, I had originally been following a different family. They got a spot on a bus because, the most vulnerable people they had some buses, some donation money for that. So then the women and children and people who were sick and had gotten colds on the caravan so far were in the buses. And so I had this commission. I was by the train track. It was night time, and all other journalists were kind of dropping like flies. So I was actually really alone.
What do you mean by dropping like flies? Just leaving?
Yeah, deciding not to go on the train
Hmm.
because they had been on earlier legs of the train, and there was so much pressure from Trump to stop the caravan. And so that was kind of dominating the news. And so that meant that the president of Mexico and local municipalities were making the train rides in the previous legs really miserable because they'd be stopped in the blazing sun or, in the cold at night. And so other journalists were like, okay, I don't know if I want to get back on this train. But I had just gotten there. So I was pretty committed and I wanted to get those images and capture that experience because it is so common. So I was by the side of the train and a journalist colleague of mine was saying, I don't know if you should go. And Magdiel actually walked up. This other journalist friend of mine had interviewed him already. And so they kind of knew each other. Then my journalist friend left and I was making nervous conversation with him. And I was like, are you nervous to go on the train? Have you gone before? And he says, I have gone, but I'm not nervous because I always go with God.
Mm.
And so I said, well, I better go with you then.
You're in good company.
Yeah. I had actually earlier in the day spoken to a group of asylum seeking families that were getting some advice because they were stopped at a shelter, and that's where I met up with them. And they were doing some meetings along the way. So there was volunteer activists and legal advisors who were kind of doing pre-assessments for people like, okay, you're going to have an asylum case that's worth asking at the border. And, some other people saying you probably don't have an asylum case. Even if they were fleeing violence, as you know, there's strict rules on what qualifies as asylum and what doesn't. And so they were among families who were being advised, not really advised, but saying, okay, this is what's going to happen when you get to the border. And this is what you say to let them know that you're seeking asylum. So I went to one of those meetings to say, I'm here, I'm a journalist. I want to do this longer story and really show what you guys are going through because right now there's a lot of sensationalism happening. And I was really curious about the culture among the caravan and people really taking care of each other. And so when I met Magdiel, he was like, oh, yeah, I heard you speak earlier. And then I found out he had a wife and a baby. So he was part of a family. And I asked if I could follow his story. And he said yes. And obviously neither of us knew it was going to turn into a lifelong friendship and
Which it did.
2-year project. But he said, yes, you can. And so it ended up being 3 days on the train with some stops. But so it wasn't until we got to the next location in sort of central northern Mexico in Hermosillo that I met Mirna, because then we reconvened with the groups that had been on the buses.
Right. And how did the family describe their emotions while crossing Mexico beyond what we see on screen?
That's an interesting question because in the making of the film, people wanted that more, wanted to hear more their voices of their fear. And it's interesting the way in which we kind of have sort of story structures in mind and kind of assumed emotions. Of course, they were scared. You hear Mirna in the film talking about separating, that decision to separate, where Magdiel goes on the train and she goes on the bus, is really, it's not a casual, okay, see you in a couple days. People die all the time on the trains. People fall off. People are kidnapped, extorted. And so she says that was, I don't know if I'll see you again. I mean, she had faith that she would. But, you really see him on his phone and trying to reach her because we were going in and out of cell service in the middle of nowhere on the train. And you don't always have access to charge the phone. And so he talks about how it was the first time they'd ever separated because they were fleeing violence and really extreme circumstances. So, of course, just in that context of that trauma, to separate from your loved ones is just scary no matter what you're doing. And I will also say, like, what I was sort of getting at the beginning of answering this is like, at the same time, it was sometimes hard to get at what they were feeling in asking them because, like, oh, what were you expecting? And these things. And she's like, we weren't thinking about like, oh, what are we going to see in the UN?
Right. It's survival mode.
The one foot in front of the other. And so, yeah, a lot of those questions that we ask about that experience came afterwards. Okay, think back about what, you're on the train, you're in that experience. What were your emotions?
Hmm.
Because you're in so much survival mode, sometimes it can be hard to access.
Right.
What am I feeling? It's such a luxury to think about what am I
Right.
feeling.
Do you think, was there anything that, like, traditions or thoughts that they clung on to during their journey or once they arrived in the US that helped them?
I mean, I know that,
Sounds like religion was one.
yes, their faith is very
Hmm.
important for both of them. Actually, Myrna now still, and from pretty early on getting to the US, I would say for her faith practice, her tradition, her connection to her family, but also really for her mental health, going to church multiple times a week is a big part of her routine.
Hmm. So faith tends to be something that can really help get them through this very difficult journey.
Yes, definitely. And it's like, I imagine, but this part I haven't specifically asked her, but I imagine too, even though I'm sure the church that she goes to looks different, but it's a thing that can be a constant, right? That's a thing she did
Exactly.
when she was at home, and it's a thing she can do here in the US. And, she goes to services in Spanish, and a lot of the people in her particular church, not only from Honduras, but from Central America specifically. So there's cultural resonance there and understanding, and people who've come on a similar timeline, similarly recently, or, varying, but so that they have that shared experience.
Hmm. Hmm. And what would you say have been some of their biggest challenges or triumphs as well since settling in Seattle?
Yeah, I mean, what we follow in the film and what we kind of discovered was the first act. So the first third of the film is this journey through Mexico and the challenge, being in detention and separated in that way. I would say that was a huge challenge for them, actually.
Do you think, were they expecting that? Did they have an idea that that might happen?
They did, yeah. And it only ended up being 3 months. I say only because sometimes people are in there for over a year.
True.
And when they're in the same situation where they've passed their credible fear interview, they're deemed eligible to be applying for asylum, but still maybe you cover these things in your podcast. But so I say only because it can sometimes be a lot longer. But I think the not knowing, which is such a big theme for many people who are, in so many parts of this process, fleeing and seeking asylum, but the not knowing when he was going to be let out
Yeah.
or if he was going to be let out, I think that made those 3 months so excruciating for both of
Right.
them.
Right. It's different when you have a date or some kind of idea, right? You can kind of cross the dates on the calendar type thing.
Right. And getting out all kind of happened quickly at the end. Like, okay, now you're getting
Right.
out. So obviously that was wonderful. But yeah, so that was really challenging because, the 3 days on the train were really hard for them.
Hmm.
And Magdiel was in the train with me and Myrna was traveling by bus. So 3 months was really hard. And Myrna at that time was just getting to the US for the first time, didn't speak any English, was trying to adjust, figuring out what's happening. And so she was really alone. So that was a really challenging part. And then what happens is he gets out and then they have this kind of plot twist miracle, one in a million thing happened to them, which is that they need a place to live. They're in Seattle and they connect to first the International Rescue Committee, who puts out the word to an interfaith network, and then someone at one synagogue in West Seattle says, "Oh, we have an extra home."
Hmm. Hmm.
And so then their story really shifts to being a really common one that you see on they're one of many on this caravan, and many people obviously are detained and have these similar experiences. And then they kind of become one in a million, and they're in this really nice house right on the
Right.
water. Me them being supported by, everyone kind of wants to be involved in this, and I'm like, oh yeah, they have a house, so I'll take them to Spanish story time at the library. I'll take Josh to preschool every Tuesday. I'll take them to get groceries on Thursdays, whatever. So all these people, kind of mostly sort of what would be kind of grandparent age to little
Hmm.
Joshua, who's about 2 at that time, really kind of become obsessed with them in a very sweet way. So I mentioned that because then in the sort of structuring of the film, and to answer your question, what were some challenges, we really saw them have this And the thread we kind of follow from that point then is, okay, what does it mean if all of your immediate needs are met? And that was kind of why we decided to make the film, right? It's like, this is stranger than fiction, and what is the value of fiction is to see another reality, right? So what would it look like if people had this level of support? And part of that answer is then you have the blessing and the burden of the mental health toll of what you've just gone through, the journey and the separation, but also, of course, the root cause of having to flee, which was, in
Right.
their case, 3 murders, extreme violence that they were leaving and fleeing against their family that was targeted against them.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that it was sort of like one in a million chance, right? And when we were watching it, one of the other viewers, their comment was, if this feels like a Cinderella story, right? This isn't really typical. In most cases, they don't end up making, this meaningful connection with the, people at the synagogue and getting this house in front of the ocean. It almost sounds idyllic. Were
Right.
you at any point, because again, it's not the typical, were you at any point, I don't know, disappointed in the sense that, this isn't your standard story and that's what you wanted to tell, like more the story of the struggles upon arriving, the more
Mhm.
practical struggles, not the emotional, because the emotionals were still there despite them having so much help and this beautiful place to live in. You can tell from the film that emotionally they were still recovering and they have a long journey of recovery.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't thinking of making the film. It was a few journalist/filmmaker colleagues of mine, friends that just kept hearing the updates that I was telling them and saying, "You gotta keep going. This story is incredible." And there was 2 reasons why I hesitated. One was because as a very kind of traditionally trained journalist, I thought I was too close to them, and it felt a little bit hard even on my spirit to kind of pick up the camera again, knowing that it's just such a vulnerable thing they're going through because it's just very intimate. And yeah, as a journalist, you're not supposed to be so close to your sources.
Mhm.
But I, figured out my own way of doing it and with a team that was really aligned with our vision of including them and having this. Ultimately, I just talked to a lot of filmmakers and they're like, yeah, I get what you're saying, but ultimately, filmmaking is different. It's a different negotiation and it's a value and an asset to your story, not just your story, but also to your film subjects or participants that you're close to them because there's this really high level of trust and care and love. So I kind of ultimately let go of that. But in this case, it's okay that I'm really close to them. I filmed their wedding.
Mhm.
The synagogue throws for them, and I was in that wedding. That's why I was there, and I filmed it while I was there. It's not the kind of thing I was telling my journalist colleagues at the time because they'd kind of think like, "That's not normal."
Mhm. Mhm.
And then the other part, yes, exactly what you're saying is that it was such an outlier story, and I worried that it could get misconstrued of like, "Oh, okay, so this is what happens. You get to the border, you get this, like, sponsors
Right.
of these really nice and in this case, very wealthy strangers, and you move into this house." And so
Yeah, I think unless you know the backstory and you have an idea of their emotional struggles, I think there might be a propensity for the viewer to think like, "Wow, they're lucky. I wish I had something like that," right? A free place to live in a beautiful house and assistance all around.
right. Yeah, I think focusing on the mental health piece was a tool to show that that's, really not the whole
That's right.
story. And also, it's woven into all these other things that any person, I think, can relate to in one way or another. It's, what does it mean to be overcome? Obviously, most viewers hopefully have not experienced the level of violence that they have, but being a young
Yeah,
family, becoming parents, or being in a new place, or dealing with, neighbors who wanna help, but, how do we navigate this stuff and having privacy? I mean, we don't really see that on film, but that's kind of, an element, our own rhythm, and overcoming any kind of trauma, but grief. I mean, grief is something that unfortunately we all do go through at one point in our lives, and so that's what they're dealing with, and so there was a lot of ways in which we thought, "Okay, well, this is what we can and will do in terms of appealing to so many different kinds of audiences." I mean, really just telling the truth of what was happening, but that was, our hope was to not let the film kind of be misconstrued or misconstrue other people's experiences of the asylum
Right,
experience.
right. And I think that's one of the beautiful things of the film is how joy and grief intertwine, right?
Yeah.
And were there any moments that you witnessed these emotions sort of collide in a way that surprised you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if it necessarily if surprise is the first word that comes to mind, but I will say like my favorite scene because I love the way that my editor and I put it together, but also it was my favorite kind of or my most moving experience as the filmmaker and their friend was the period of time when this is a little bit of a spoiler, but when Myrna is pregnant with their second child, and it's the 9 months like leading up to their asylum hearing. Actually, the baby was born in late summer, and then they had their asylum hearing just like 3 months later. And so that year was a lot of building tension with this pending asylum hearing, the final one, and then bringing this new life into the world. And with Magdiel in particular, the day that he was leaving to go to the hospital, and I was going to be the one taking care of Josh. At the time, I knew him. I was very close to him. I spoke English and Spanish, and I was able to just go there and be in his space, in their home and take care of him. And so we're there, and I just picked up the camera and asked him how he was feeling. And I thought he was just going to kind of talk about, yeah, so I guess I was a little surprised. I thought he would just say, yeah, I'm excited. I'm about to go to the hospital. This is it. And he gets so emotional in this really raw and beautiful way, just really showing and expressing just this quintessential example of the bittersweetness.
Mhm.
And for him, it was because it was bringing up so much emotion of missing his dad, who had been killed in Honduras, and which was part of why they were fleeing.
Oh, his dad.
And
Okay, so I didn't know that he wasn't his child.
no, Magdiel's dad had been killed.
Oh, Magdiel's dad had been killed.
So having a second child for him, for Magdiel, brought up so much grief, right? This feeling of like when you lose someone so close to
Got
you,
it. Yeah.
and then when kind of every happy thing happens after that, you're happy, but you also think, well, I wish that person was here to see this.
Right. Right.
And so that just was the kind of peak of this joy and sorrow and grief and happiness being woven together in a single moment
Which is
and then in a single scene. And by the end, we see them coming home with the baby and Josh meeting the baby for the first time. And we hear Magdiel saying, all I want is to tell my dad you have a granddaughter.
yeah, and I think this is unfortunately just so typical of, those of us who immigrate to another country. There's wins and there's losses in the sense that, there's that bittersweetness that you're talking about, the joy of bringing this new child into the world and the grief over not being able to share the special moment with those whom we love, either because they've passed or they're back in our home country.
Right, such a good point. It could be the grief, yeah, not being able to show. It could have been that he couldn't show his daughter to his dad because they weren't in the same place. Or someone here who was born in the US might relate to that because they also had a child after losing a parent.
Right.
So, yes, absolutely. It was just such a human moment that really pierced through and in such a beautiful and painful way. So, that was, I guess, surprising for that moment, but then that's a bit of sort of the thesis of the whole film in a way.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I know that documentaries are often limited by time and format. So, were there parts of the family's journey that you filmed or that you learned about but couldn't include in the final cut?
Hmm. You know, there was, so we ended up editing over the course of 2 years. And so in the first year, we had kind of a finished cut, and it was a little less than a year after they'd been granted. And Magdiel, even though we talk about in the film how, well, in the final version, right? But there was this time period when he didn't want to show that he was working.
Mhm.
He didn't have a work permit,
Right.
which is somewhat common for asylum seekers. In theory, everyone who's an asylum seeker, who's allowed to be here to wait for their asylum proceedings should get a work
Right.
permit after a number of
Yeah.
days. But their clock was stopped because there's this sort of incentivizing of getting through the system quicker, and their attorney asked for more time, and for some reason that stops the clock. So then they were stuck in this limbo and weren't given their work permits because she was like, well, to have more time to prepare, that's going to give us some better chance at the case. So, that was the decision she made, which makes sense. But then it has this consequence. I don't know if that policy is still in place. And so they were working for people through the synagogue, and the synagogue thought, okay, they don't have a work permit, so we'll do this system where we're just doing these donations, and they donated online through the synagogue, and then those donations were given to Magdiel and Myrna, and so it was more like a trade.
Hmm.
This really creative workaround, but Magdiel was still quite nervous.
Sure.
Even though they'd gotten their social security numbers, they'd been granted asylum, and of course, the whole process is quite scary and intense, and so I understand. And then we kept editing, and another almost a year passed, and we would go back to him and we say, what do you think about including this? And we've got Eddie, this other character, explaining the whole system of how it was all above board, and he was like, okay, let's try it. And I mentioned that, and that ended up sort of the opposite of what you're saying. It was originally not included, and then it was. And I mentioned that because we wanted to show people who might also want to support asylum seekers that this was a creative workaround, and also speak to how traumatizing the process here can be, having a lasting effect. And it was so important to our story because as a human being here new in this country, Magdiel was so attached to his own identity of being a provider and a worker and someone contributing to society. And he was kind of handcuffed in this way.
Right.
So it was just an interesting journey kind of to go through with him. And he had relaxed a little bit and let us do that. So that's kind of the opposite of what you asked. But I'm trying to think of things, I was filming for so many years. There were just some adorable things that we didn't include because you kind of have to make hard decisions. Like there's a lovely scene of Myrna showing these like friends of theirs who are the kids of some of the members of the synagogue who are around their age how to make tortillas. Or there's another scene of those same friends teaching Myrna how to drive because Magdiel has learned to drive, but Myrna also learns to drive. We have footage of that, and those get cut out. It's just because there's limited space.
Right. And of course, there's these intimate moments that just stay with you, right? And even make it into the documentary.
Yeah. And when I showed Myrna and Magdiel the edited cut for the first time, Myrna at the end was like, that's it? Where's the rest of it? I was like, oh, I was worried they were going to be bored or something.
Right.
So I have all the footage for them if they ever want it, because there's lots of sweet moments with the kids and all this stuff. So
Yeah, I was going to ask that too. Like, what was their reaction to seeing the finished documentary?
yeah, they really loved it. The moment when Myrna was really moved to tears was there's a scene when we hear her talking about the ways in which she keeps Honduras alive and with Josh. This was before Chelsea was born, with her son Joshua. And she talks about how, she kind of tells him about Honduras as if it's a story. I would go walking in the pastures and I would, tell my mom I was going to go give my dad lunch, but I just wanted to be alone. She's one of 15 kids. And I wanted to walk and listen to the birds. And it's just this very dreamy way she talks about it. And so we did this visual, storytelling in that moment of footage of Honduras and these beautiful green pastures right near where they're from. So that it would be, as authentic as possible.
She was very
And
moved.
that was the part that really got her and, really shows how much
Right.
she's homesick. And they're really country kids, they grew up in rural Honduras. And
Was that the first time they were seeing the ocean?
no, actually, Myrna for a period of time worked in Roatan, like the island in Honduras. It's a tourist location. So they'd seen.
I just vaguely remember getting that feeling that he was just in awe, that this is so surreal to him. But maybe that was my reaction.
Yeah, but we do see them seeing snow for the first time, which is fun.
If you're ready to grow your income and impact, head to the link in the description box to learn more about my training program. For now, let's get back into the episode. So, kind of along the same lines of going behind the scenes a little bit, were there any sort of difficult editorial decisions that you had to make about what parts of the story to highlight versus leave out?
Yeah, making a film is something hard because you have so much material to work from. And I will say that, like, this is a good moment to shout out to my editor. She's really my creative partner in making the film. And, there are some directors that edit their own films, but I was so close to them and so precious with all the footage. And I kind of loved all the material that it was so helpful to have her being the editor and making the chops. And then I would kind of leave and come back, and then, the things that I loved were gone, but I loved what she created.
She's more like objective, more of like not as emotionally involved, and she can kind of see the story.
Yeah, she's such an amazing artist and storyteller. So much of it was hard. Yeah, I think, there's certain scenes that we really cut out at the last minute. Like
Mhm.
these scenes, for example, with Myrna that I mentioned. She's just kind of sassy and funny in a way that you don't see in the rest of the film in those scenes, particularly the one where she's like teaching them how to make tortillas and she's kind of making fun of them, but also being really encouraging. And you just see this other side of her. And so that felt really, yeah, I had some grief about letting go of that because I think otherwise maybe people perceive Myrna as a little bit more guarded or quieter. But there was things that were hard just to kind of keep track of time. Like, okay, how much do people need like these time markers of how much time has passed and how close are we to the hearing or how long have they been in the US? Oh, I will say also, this is an important one. The balance of their story, Magdiel and Myrna's story, and weaving in the story of their
Mhm.
new friends and community through the synagogue. Because I met Magdiel and Myrna a year before I met them, and then we wanted to tell their story. But of course, this new community coming in was very relevant and really changed their lives. And they had a story to tell as well with their own history. But we wanted to really strike a balance of the film at
Mhm.
no point feeling like a white savior story or that it just suddenly someone else is taking the wheel and it's a different film, even just for kind of aesthetic continuity. And so there were a lot of really interesting conversations in how to do that. So, for example, with reviews of earlier cuts of the film before we were done, people would say, like, okay, I understand that concern, but I'm craving this kind of like, what is their connection? What's their relationship like? What do they think of each other? You can see that they love each other, but kind of like, I want to hear more words there. What's the motivation with this connection, all these things. And so we were really resistant to kind of having a thread of Magdalene and Myrna saying something as simple as like, we're so thankful, because that's kind of
Mhm.
boring. And it also kind of, it's like you can see that. It's kind of obvious. And also kind of goes a little more in this category of a white savior story. But then, and we thought, that what the people sort of wanted was these words from the synagogue,
Mhm.
the community, these different two main families you see in the film. Then we were watching together this scene where we see Magdalene and Joshua at this Hanukkah party with them, and they're just laughing and having a great time and learning about Hanukkah and singing the song. And then afterwards, they go home and they're by their Christmas tree, and Magdiel is doing this
Mhm.
call. He's trying to do this video call with his mom, talking about Christmas and presents and stuff. And then we hear Magdiel talk. And so this was like a big light bulb moment for me. It was like, oh no, let's have Magdiel talk about it. Like, speaking to the why was it important for this Jewish community to support them? And we hear him say, "I'm hearing about how they keep their own
Mhm.
story alive, and I wanna do that too," is essentially what he's saying. I can't remember exactly the quote. And so it just kind of checks all these boxes of, like, it just goes a step further. Like, you don't have to say, "I'm thankful." Like, if you talk about what you're getting from that relationship and this learning that you're applying to your own life, you just all the other stuff, the being thankful and caring about each other and loving each other, that's all assumed. And then you're like, oh, they're so deep in this relationship that they're learning from each other.
Yeah, it sounds more substantial, authentic.
Yeah, you just skip all these steps and you get so much deeper. And so that was such a light bulb moment for me in terms of a few things. One, that you can do that. You can
Mhm.
kind of skip things and it will be understood. But like A, B, and you just go straight to D and everyone understands kind of like what's happened before. And the other thing was, and this happened then again and again after this, but like, okay, maybe people are asking for X and Y, but you can give them A and B and it's going to solve the same problem. And so that was really satisfying when we came up with that solution, my editor and I. And then we felt this freedom to kind of
Mhm.
keep
Mhm.
doing that. And that really helped us in the crafting.
And since the filming ended, do you know how the family is doing today?
Yeah, I talk to them all the time. I was talking to them yesterday, actually. The kids are in school, and we actually had a screening there's a church above the preschool where Chelsea goes. We had a screening there, and Myrna was like, "Yeah, that sounds great." Because some of the teachers had come to our screening at the Seattle International Film Festival, and then they were inspired to do a screening there. And then in the church above that preschool,
Mhm.
they also do accompaniment welcoming work with other, refugees and asylum seekers. So we held a screening, which was a joint fundraiser. And then some parents from the preschool came, like they had kind of heard about this story. So then, there's ripple effects of more people understanding their story, but also the experience of seeking asylum in general. And that kind of alleviates, like Magdalene and Myrna don't have to keep telling their story
Right.
every time if someone has seen their film. So, anyways, still in touch with the other families of the synagogue community that are in the film. And I try to go up there a couple times a year.
No, that's beautiful. So, shifting gears a little bit into like what this was like for you, right? So how did this experience change you both as a journalist and perhaps as a person?
Yeah, there's kind of multiple categories. When the pandemic started, I was still living in Bogota in Colombia. So I finished filming, and when borders started shutting, because their asylum hearing was December 2020, and they were given that date, long before the pandemic started. So I had just been there in February of 2020, and then I was back home in Colombia, and borders were shutting. My friends got stuck in Peru, and I thought, okay. And I wanted to be back because I wanted to go to
Mhm.
Passover Seder's. And so I was going to be back. And I thought, okay, I'll just leave Colombia with a couple suitcases. I don't know when I'll be back. Anyways, I didn't end up getting back for a year, but I kind of left. I just thought, like, okay, I could just give up on this film project because I don't know if I'll get up there. Or I could leave my partner at the time, my friends, my life, my work, my social life, my apartment, and sort of choose the film. And that's what I did. So I left from one day to the next, and shelter in place had just started here. Anyway, so I kind of hunkered down here and quarantined and then drove up a few weeks later and found a place to live in
Wow.
Seattle. So then I lived in Seattle for a year and a half. And then so many things had changed in my life and the world. So I just decided to move back to the US. It just made sense. I mean, I went back for a few months to Colombia, but closed things out. But yeah, so that really changed my life. And now I'm back in where I'm from in the Bay Area. But I think, I've thought a lot about this. I think their love story really inspired me and touched me from the beginning. There's a scene of them also kind of having this last minute
Mhm.
wedding at the border as well. They have two weddings in the film. And just their sweetness together, I think that really shines through in the film because that
Mhm.
was something I was kind of looking for in my life at the time. And so I was really excited by their love story and, kind of seeing
Yeah.
them as relationship goals in some ways and just how it changed me. Yeah, like just the honor of being able to observe how do two people navigate that, what they've been through together, and how do they heal together and separately, because we really see them kind of approaching that in different ways.
Yeah, one thing that I appreciated from the film is how the focus seems to be more on their individual experiences and their emotional journeys, as opposed to focusing on the immigration process itself and the immigration regulations and all the bureaucracy and all that.
Yeah, we just realized that was the unique thing we had. We had really intimate access with them. When I say we, it's really me in that case because I was one filming, and that was really purposeful to be just one camera and one person in the room at all times to not be disruptive. And the person behind the camera is someone they know and trust. So that was really intentional. And yet, other films that are all
Right.
about the policy, for one. Also, the policy keeps changing. And so we thought, well, if we can create a story that makes you kind of fall in love with this family and this experience and see your own story in one way or another in their experience, and that builds empathy and compassion. And then hopefully you leave the film and
Right. Exactly.
go, the parts that you want to learn more about, you go look it up.
Exactly. Yeah, I guess it is a big responsibility to tell these deeply personal stories like this one.
Yeah, that's definitely a part of the answer to the other question and how it's sort of changed me and affected me. I think the weight of that is very heavy for me even now because, we're looking for distribution. We're hoping to be on a wider platform. And there is a pressure as a storyteller, journalist, filmmaker to feel like, okay, we went through this. We've asked so much of them, so many hours of interviews and time spent in their home. It needs to be big. It needs to make a difference. And I think it has made a difference already, but there's kind of that feeling of, okay, we need to be out there. We need to reach more people. It needs to all be worth it for them. I feel, for the responsibility I feel towards them. And so I don't know if it's changed me, but that's definitely had an effect on me, an impact on me. And yeah, it's been an honor to be able to do it. I hope we reach more people.
Yeah. If there was one feeling or understanding that you hope viewers take away from All We Carry, what would that be?
A mission that's kind of driven me as a storyteller is this idea that you can't hate anyone whose story you know. And there's a lot of hate right now and a lot of
Misinformation
or, not paying attention to long form, full, three-dimensional human being stories and just assumptions or numbers. As particularly with the topic of immigration. So that is my hope, that it spreads understanding and not hate.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights and for amplifying such an important story. Now, where can listeners watch All We Carry?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for asking that. Okay, so you can follow us on our social media, which is at All We Carry Doc, DOC, for documentary, on Instagram and Facebook. And then our website is allwecarrydoc.com. So on there's a contact form. You can reach us there. And also, or just our email is allwecarrydoc@gmail.com. But yeah, so right now we're doing these community screenings and screenings at universities and, programs like Where I Met You. And we're waiting for widespread distribution where people could see us streaming or on broadcast. So more on that soon, hopefully. But in the meantime, you can reach out to us to try, you could organize this community screening at your own church or synagogue or mosque or community center or university or high school or anywhere, your office, your living room. We kind of organize those on these one-off bases, and that's how we're doing that now. But there will be more and more opportunities of how to watch and, work with us in the coming months. So
Excellent. Any upcoming projects?
Well, not yet. I shot a short film about this amazing trans woman in Bogota. I need to edit that film. I need to get support to edit that. But she's just the most amazing, hilarious person I've ever met. But it's actually, I want it to be a comedy because she's so funny. But the story behind the story is that she's in her 60s and everyone calls her Mother Cindy, and short for Cinderella. There's just so many beautiful elements of her story, but the story behind the story is that it's a privilege to grow old, in particular context of, in parts of Latin America, the life expectancy of trans women is as low as 35. And so resilience, her story of resilience, and also starting a new career in her late 50s as a fashion designer. So
yeah,
keep an eye out for that. I don't know where, but she's amazing. Yeah, right now I'm looking for journalism work, and I'd love to be doing actually audio work, so radio maybe. You can follow me at cadyvoge.com or Cady Voge, CadyVoge at Instagram as well.
Wonderful. Well, Cady, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you again for...
Thank you so much for having me, Mariella.
Of course. All right. Take good care.
You too.
Before you go, don't forget to grab your free introductory guide to immigration evaluations. It's linked in the description box. And let's keep the conversation going. See you next time.